Good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everyone's doing well today. I see some folks joining on and commenting. Wayne, good to see you this morning. Hope you're all right. Charles, good to see you on here. Hope you're doing well. We are currently making our way through a study of what's called the AD 70 doctrine. Let me start off by saying this. Today is our third video in this series. And I think it's important for us to study things like this from time to time because, the Bible talks to us about truth and error, being able to discern between what's good and evil, Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14. And every now and then you have these things that come up that perhaps challenge what you have always heard, challenge what you've always believed, and we need to examine them in the light of Scripture. And so that's what we're doing with this particular doctrine. This is something that I was confronted with a couple of months ago by an advocate of this teaching. And so I started doing a lot of reading in my own personal time, watching debates, listening to the other side. So the AD 70 doctrine basically teaches that Jesus came back in AD 70. He didn't come physically, they say. He didn't come literally, physically. It was a judgment upon the earth, upon everybody now, when Jesus came to destroy Jerusalem, which was done, of course, by the Roman Empire. That is, the very ground level position of AD 70. Other parts of that are he's not coming back again. There is no second coming. There's not going to be a future resurrection from the dead. That's it. So we've examined a few different things about it. I'm going to pop these up on the screen here real quick, and then we'll get into today's stuff. If you have any questions or comments as we're going through this, please feel free to throw it in the comment section here, and I'll address it. I'll address it as I see it. So it's known by different names, as we've talked about. Realized eschatology, meaning the last days have already been realized. It's not coming back. It's not going to happen again. It's also known as the Max King doctrine because he's the one who popularized it. A guy from Warren, Ohio, back in the early 1970s, started going to preachers' meetings up in that area and spreading this doctrine around. One of the main passages they like to use is Matthew 16, verses 27 and 28. We covered that yesterday, so we're not going to cover it all again today. So again, at its most basic, this doctrine teaches that all prophecy has been fulfilled, which includes the second coming of Christ. And so there is no future resurrection, and Jesus is not coming back. Everything. And when I say everything, I'm not exaggerating. Everything these guys do, everything these guys talk about, whether they write an article, a book, whether they do something online through social media, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, it is always about this doctrine. This is the only thing they talk about. They may start off on some other subject, but they'll always circle back around to talking about AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem. Every time. I guarantee it. In my experience, that's what I've seen. I call this doctrine eschatological Gnosticism. Basically, what that means is you listen to these guys, and again, I've done this. You talk to them. I've done that. You read their writings. You watch their videos. I've done all that. And we have these statements from them over and over again. They'll say stuff like, well, we have chosen to study the Bible. The basics of preterism are so simple that you overlook it. Preterism, they're also known as preterists. That word is a word that means past. They believe all prophecy is past. Nothing else is going to be fulfilled. And so they say, this is so simple, you just overlook it. And yet, if it's so simple, and if it's in every passage of the Bible they look to, and well, not every passage. I want to be fair. I don't want to misrepresent them. But as often as they find it, as they say it's in there, you'd think you wouldn't overlook it, but they say that you do. I was listening to one guy preach, and he was talking about it, and he said to his crowd, he said, do you see that? I know you probably don't. It's Gnosticism. He had special knowledge that nobody else had. They'll talk about those of us who believe that Jesus is coming back, that there will be a final judgment. They'll say, well, they just don't understand. I had to study, and they need to study too. Implying that we don't study. Implying that we don't know what we're talking about. So that's why I call this doctrine, or refer to it as eschatological Gnosticism. They have special knowledge about the final days that nobody else has. Everybody else has it wrong. They claim it is the most consistent way to understand the Bible, and the reason they make that claim is because they've written their own dictionary. And again, I don't mean they've literally gone out and published a dictionary, but they've defined their own terms in this doctrine. So just for example, they'll say heaven and earth, it's used physically, but it's also used spiritually, and it's talking about the Old Testament, or it's talking about Israel. And they'll look at Matthew 24:35, and they'll say, well, heaven and earth there is the old covenant, because heaven and earth will pass away. Oh, and they also teach, by the way, and I didn't have this on the previous slide, they also say the world is never going to be destroyed, the world's never coming to an end. That's part of this teaching. They believe the resurrection of the body is not a physical resurrection in the future. Rather, it was a resurrection of the church in AD 70. Again, everything focuses on that one point in time, that one point in history. They'll say things like, well, 2 Peter 3 is Matthew 24. And by the way, today's video, we're specifically going to cover Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Those 3 chapters that deal with the destruction of Jerusalem. And they'll say things like, there is no transition verse in Matthew 24. We're going to cover that today. They talk about the coming kingdom. They say, well, Jesus said he was coming in their day, and if you don't believe that, then you call Jesus a liar. They use very bombastic terminology. Well, that's just, and they all do it. And I've watched multiple debates that these guys have. And in every debate, they end up having to apologize because they get, just frankly, they get so rude and arrogant and loud. Particularly one guy who holds this teaching, I've seen him have to apologize multiple times to the guy he's debating and to the moderators because he's just so, he's got a complex or something. I don't know, but I've seen it many times. So we've covered all this. So let's move on to what we're going to talk about today. So there are 3 passages in your Bible that I want to look at that they hone in on constantly and say that this is what we're talking about. That, again, there's no end of the world, there's no judgment coming, there's no future resurrection. Jesus isn't coming back. So we're going to cover the parallel accounts of Jesus' teaching. It's recorded by 3 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when you break it down like I'm going to break it down, it is so simple. One of the things that you'll note about this doctrine, and I've got several articles from several different guys that talk about it. It is so, the word I've used is convoluted. It's so twisted in the sense of they won't stay in one passage long enough to make any sense of it. They'll make their point from one verse out of a passage, and then they'll move on to the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And they're very good at moving around pretty quickly. So I see more people joining on here. We're getting ready to get started on today's. It's funny, I say that 9 minutes into the video, but here we are. So I see that several others have joined, Owsley's and Connie Barden, Sharon Hedden, and my mother, morning mom, and a few others. So let's get started on today's topic, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So I've got a Bible here that has 2 markers. I've got one marker set in Mark 13, and I've got another marker set in Luke chapter 21, and I'm currently opening my Bible to Matthew chapter 24. So Wayne says, does Daniel chapter 9 deal with the destruction of Jerusalem? Wayne, that's a good question. I'm going to cover this in another video because the book of Daniel does in fact talk about these things. So I don't want to get into that today because I just don't have enough time. But we're going to cover the last few chapters of Daniel. So good question, and stay tuned to future videos. Let's get started in Matthew chapter 24. What I've done here is I've created 3 columns, one column for each of the chapters where Jesus is recorded as having discussed the destruction of Jerusalem. And being parallel accounts, they're going to say the same thing, all right? So that's important to note. First thing I want you to notice here in Matthew chapter 24, and again, it's consistent in Mark 13 and Luke chapter 21, is that you have an introduction to the thought. So Jesus has been in the temple, and this precedes Matthew chapter 24. Mark doesn't record all the details, nor does Luke, that Matthew does. And that's the benefit of having 3 different gospel accounts. We have details in some that are not in others, but they give us a full picture. So you have to, Matthew 24 is preceded by something. And we know that Jesus has been in the temple, obviously, Matthew 23, rebuking the scribes and the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. And as Matthew 23 ends, he says this, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to you. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." Then he says this in verse 38, "See, your house is left to you desolate." He warns Jerusalem right there, and he's in the temple. It's left to you desolate. "For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." In other words, something's coming to Jerusalem because Jerusalem has consistently rejected Christ and his message. That's what leads us into Matthew chapter 24. So they exit the temple, Jesus with his apostles, they leave the temple, and they're looking at the structures, the buildings of the temple. And Jesus says, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." And again, Mark says the same thing, or Mark records the same thing, and Luke records the same thing. It's consistent. They're writing about the same event, the same teaching that Jesus made here. So then his disciples inquire, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" When is all this going to happen, and how will we know? How will we know that it's about to happen? That's your introduction. So I'm going to flip over just real quick to Mark chapter 13 and verse 3. It says, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, 'Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things will be fulfilled?'" And when you look at Mark's account, the things he's talking about is verse 2. Not one stone will be left upon another. All of it's going to be thrown down. He's talking about the temple. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then you look at Luke's account, Luke chapter 21. He says the same thing in verses 5 and 6. He's talking about the temple and Jerusalem being destroyed. The disciples say, "When will these things be, and what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" And you'll notice in each of these accounts, they specifically ask, how are we going to know when this is going to happen? When Jerusalem is going to be destroyed? So from there, Jesus launches into his answer. Well, there's going to be some deception. Matthew 24 verses, I've got it here, verses 4 through 8. There are going to be false Christs who arise. They're going to deceive many. And so what I'm going to point out here, particularly throughout Matthew chapter 24, is a certain phrase or a couple of certain phrases. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be troubled. Matthew 24:6. He says, "All these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet." There are going to be troubles. There's going to be persecution. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation. All these things are the beginning of sorrow. So he's saying there are indicators. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And we know, even from history, we could leave the Bible out of the discussion here and talk about just secular history. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Absolutely. So there's going to be a period of deception and troubles and rumors and things of this. And then he talks about the fact that you guys, the ones who are asking him about when these things are going to happen, you're going to be persecuted. And Matthew 24:9 specifically says, "For my name's sake. But if you endure to the end, you will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." Well, the end of what? What were they asking? When is this going to happen? What indicators will there be? Well, the gospel's preached throughout the world during the first century, but there's a very specific time when Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. But so he talks about persecution again in all of those accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And let me flip over here real quick to Luke's account, Luke chapter 21 and verses 10 through 19. And Luke uses this account or this language in that section. He talks about all these things. So listen to Luke chapter 21 and verse 12. "Before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, Again, so you have this consistent phrase in all three accounts, these things and those things. That is not insignificant. There's going to be periods of deception. There's going to be periods of persecution before these things happen, before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And now, to me, this section here, Matthew 24, 15 through 22, Mark 13, 14 through 20, Luke 21, 20 through 24, nails this down forever. Because again, these people, these guys who hold the AD 70 doctrine, that Jesus, they teach that Jesus is not coming back for judgment. They teach there is no future resurrection. They teach that the world is going to stand forever. They tell us, they teach that the judgment came in AD 70, that Christ came back as judge in AD 70. Now, I'm also going to do a separate video on the New Testament, what it teaches about the final judgment, because there is going to be a final judgment. It's always spoken of as universal. The final judgment, when Christ returns, is always spoken of as universal. The destruction of Jerusalem is a local event, and I'm going to show it to you. Matthew chapter 24, beginning in verse 15. We're not going to read all of these verses, but just making the point that it's a local event. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel, and so Wayne, that's a reference to Daniel chapter 9, but also to Daniel chapter 11. Spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. Well, the holy place is the temple. And again, we could go to secular history and look at that. He says this, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Why would he say that if Jesus came back to judge the world? Was the whole world in Judea? Well, of course not. This was a local judgment on Jerusalem. And again, you have to go back to Matthew 23 and verses 37 through 39 when he tells them that that's what's going to happen. But then you look at Mark's account in Mark 13, beginning in verse 14. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, Matthew says the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Again, this is a local event. Jesus did not come back as the universal judge in AD 70. And then Luke chapter 21 and starting in verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her, Judea, depart. The judgment, the universal judgment when Christ returns is spoken of, number one, as a universal event, and number two, you can't escape it. And number three, I'm not going to be in Judea. All right? Unless something rather significant changes, I'm not going to be in Judea. Mark says, Colossians states that the gospel had been preached to every creature. Yeah, Colossians 1:23, and there are other passages too. Now, we understand that doesn't mean it was preached literally to every human being who was upon the face of the earth, but it went throughout the whole world. I mean, that's what Paul was doing, and others who were traveling throughout the first century preaching the gospel. So these people in Jerusalem, the disciples specifically, are told, when you see these signs that Daniel talked about, get out of town. You know, and Josephus writes about that too, that Christians were spared from the destruction of Jerusalem because they knew what Jesus taught. All right? You'll know. Again, and all three writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say you will know when these things are going to happen. Again, we're not going to read all of these verses, but listen to just a couple. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 23. If anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Again, this is a forewarning of what it's going to look like. This is what's going to be happening, and I've given you advanced warning. You are going to know when Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. And then he says, let me just illustrate it for you, he says. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. So again, if you're paying attention to the text, these things, these days, those things, those days, The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man. They say he came back literally. Jesus uses the word sign. In other words, there are indicators. He is coming back, yes, to visit judgment upon Jerusalem, but he didn't literally come back in the city of Jerusalem. He used the Romans to punish the Jewish people, to destroy the temple, and there would be indicators. And you keep reading that text there. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. They have some interesting teaching about clouds. They say anytime the clouds are mentioned in the Bible, that means God's glory, God's presence was what's the word they use? Not shadowed, but obscured. That's the word they use. Okay. Like I told you, they write their own dictionary. So again, we're talking about signs, about indicators. Then you start reading in Matthew 24 and verse 32, learn this parable of the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. You know when the seasons are going to change by looking at trees, is what he says. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the door. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation, here we go, the people I'm talking to, will by no means pass away till all these things be fulfilled. What things? The deception, the persecution, the you'll know, the indicators, the signs. This generation is going to see all this stuff. All this is going to take place. The disciples asked him about the destruction of Jerusalem. He said, there are going to be plenty of indicators. Get out of Judea. Get out of town. Run to the mountains. I've told you. He's given them warning. One of their teachings, one of the AD 70, the people who believe that there is no future judgment, no future resurrection, and the earth's going to last forever, one of their teachings is, and they're very adamant about this, there's no transition verse in Matthew 24. You know, traditionally, and I'm getting ready to do this, we talk about, okay, Matthew 24 verses 1 through 35 talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, but then in verse 36 there's a transition. The AD 70 advocates say there is no transition verse. We're going to blow that out of the water right now. To make that statement just shows you how bent they are on their own deception. No signs. There's another event that he talks about of which he says there will be no indicators. And so here, think about this. Not only does Jesus say that, Paul and Peter concur. You read 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. You read 2 Peter chapter 3. The day of the Lord is coming as a thief in the night. Now look at all these. I'm going to use my cursor here. Look at all these words here. Deception, persecution, get out of town. You'll know. Here are the signs. In response to the destruction of Jerusalem. And how will we know, Lord? Well, you'll know. All right? And then we get to Matthew 25 and chapter 24 and verse 36. And here's the thing, each gospel writer does this. First word, but. Mark 13:32, first word, but. Luke 21:34, first word, but. And this is so simple. The word but is I explained it the other day. I want to go into a little more detail about it today. This is a particle in the Greek language, and it serves as it can either serve in the Greek language as a continuation or as an adversative conjunction. So it either will continue the thought or it will show a change in thought. So for the first 34, 35 verses, Jesus has been talking about signs and indicators and persecution, deception, and you'll know when you need to get out of town. Now, either that's going to continue or it's going to change with this word but. And again, all three gospel writers do this. Of that day and hour, no one knows. If that's not a transition, I don't know what is. I'm going to turn over to Mark chapter 13 here real quick. And verse 32, but of that day and hour, no one knows. You will know when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel prophesied about, when you see them standing in the holy place, you will know, and you need to get out of the mountain. You need to get out of Jerusalem. You need to get out of Judea. You need to flee to the mountains. Mark 13:32, same language. Of that day and hour, no one knows. We go to Luke chapter 21. We go down to verse 34. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. So the but, again, in the Greek language, it's either a continuation of the same thought or it's adversative. In other words, it changes. If it's a continuation of the same thought, why does the subject matter completely change from you will know to nobody knows? That's how crazy this doctrine is. All right, let's do this. And and I've already touched on this a bit, but this is how I'm going to wrap up the video today. This just nails it down forever. Think about it. These guys actually teach that there is no future judgment. They teach that there is no future resurrection from the dead. They teach that the earth is going to stand forever. And I'm going to tell you, one of the crazy things that they do is they use Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 4. The earth abides forever. And they say, see, the Bible teaches the earth is going to last forever, which shows a very fundamental understanding of the book of Ecclesiastes on their part. We're not studying Ecclesiastes today, though. So look at these verses I've got here real quick. Matthew 24, verse 15. Oh, wrong page. Verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination, listen, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, standing in the temple, whoever reads, now that's me and you. Think about that. Whoever reads, let him understand. I'm reading it, so I need to understand this. I never saw the Roman army standing in the holy place. I can read about it. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Nobody can flee the judgment day. And again, we're going to do a separate video on that. I think I'm going to do that tomorrow, talk about the resurrection and the final judgment. Then you go to Mark chapter 13 and verse 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Again, I'm the reader, so let me understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This was a local event that happened to Jerusalem. This was not universal judgment. And to teach that is just completely crazy, dishonest. Frankly, I don't know the best word to use. And then we go to Luke chapter 21, verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Remember what Jesus said at the end of Matthew 23? Your house is left desolate. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her, in the midst of Judea, depart, and let not those who are in the country enter. Don't come back. If you're outside of town, don't come back into town. Get out, because this has been prophesied. It's here, and you're going to have a lot of trouble if you go back into town. Transitions, because he was asked 2 questions, not 1. Right? Sheila says, so we that are here now will not be resurrected by their account. That's right, Sheila. There is no future resurrection. When you die, you go to heaven if you're a Christian. I'm not 100% certain on their teaching about hell. But, that really doesn't matter, because their teaching is there is no future resurrection. The earth's going to last forever. There's no future judgment. You die, and then you go into eternity. We live by faith, not by sight. Yeah, see, I didn't see the destruction of Jerusalem. I didn't have the opportunity to flee to the mountains, to get out of Judea. When you break down those 3 chapters like this, and they're completely parallel, they say the same thing. There may be a little variation like there is in other parallel accounts in the Gospels. They're saying the exact same thing. Jesus did judge Jerusalem in AD 70. No question about that. He said he would. All right? That doesn't mean there's not a future judgment. So let's do this. We'll come back tomorrow and we will talk about the New Testament's teaching on the final judgment, the universal judgment, the return of Christ, and things like that. I've already been going for 31 minutes, so I need to wrap it up today. How convenient. Well, there's a lot of conveniences in this doctrine. I'll tell you what, I'll give you there's a good site you can go to. It's, I don't know how many of you get this paper. It's called Seek the Old Paths. You can go to the Seek the Old Paths website, and there's actually a link in there on that website for the AD 70 doctrine. There's some articles in there, one by Garland Robinson, one of them's by Ted Clark, and there's a couple other links, but you can go there. Pretty interesting stuff. But this doctrine it's very easily seen through. I mean, just look at the text here and let it speak for itself. All right, guys. Appreciate y'all being on here today, all the comments and questions. Again, if anything comes to your mind after the live stream is over, you can still comment here. You can send me a private message, however you want to do it. But I appreciate you being on here today, and I plan on seeing you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Let's talk about the universal final judgment. Let's talk about the resurrection and things like this. All right? Have a good day, and we will see you on the next video.